Um, Hello, everybody. So sorry for my bad English. I try to perfect my English since 3 months on Duolingo, but I don't do a miracle. So sorry, and sorry for the pronunciation. I write this text in French and with the help of Gemini and the wonderful Gemini and wonderful Jim Porter. Thank you, Jim. The surveillance of Jim Porter. So I try to. I normally when I talk about my work, I like improvisation, and I never read a text. So this is a special for me because I try to read my text in English, and so sorry again. Okay. I'm going to, donc ça c'est the Foucault, the head of Foucault in the cover. And my editor, my publisher wants a little bit color, so the two boats, enfin the mussel and the boat are in orange, but the original drawing is here. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about how I did this work. I can't pinpoint the exact starting point for this work on madness and Foucault, but I think one of the main impulses was biographical. I read somewhere that between Foucault's life and the work he did in his book, the work he did throw in this book, Foucault engaged an intellectual struggle that were probably related to some of the conflict he encountered in his life, particularly his homosexuality and the repressive norms that condition sexuality, for example. Hence, the mystery that one's own sexuality can in ways be representative for everyone. On the other hand, I had previously done graphic work. Graphic works on the relationship between the language and the body, spoken language, performed language, the act of saying. It's my intérêt. The question of how to speak and in what form we can say who we are. Three modalities come to mind. The briskness of Oscar Wilde aphorism. So I make a book on this. This is my Oscar. It's on with Méliès here in the moon because Oscar have a moon face. So I joke with that. The performance of speech in Lacan, Jacques, little bit hysteric, but it's Lacan. The stratification of discourses that fix, determine, and designate the history of a subject for Foucault. So I read Foucault text History of Madness several times, and it was dazzling. Foucault's language, the beauty of his sentence, the visual, ça va? Oui? The visual power contained within them. I saw the text and I then made a montage, a montage in the cinematographic sense. You know, it's a clin d'œil at Pierrot le Fou of Godard. Anna Karina do that on the camera. And it's me, but it's me. Piece by piece, juxtaposing one with another, slowing down the sentence with the image in a new way of captioning. First, there was the wonder of the medieval spatial topographies and the iconography of Hieronymus Bosch, donc Jérôme Bosch, and Peter Bruegel, where Foucault speaks of a new object that makes its appearance in the imaginary space of the Renaissance. C'est là. With all this formation of little ships of fools, La Nave Fou, Stultifera Navis. Everybody speak Latin in Greek. It's
At
Berkeley.
Berkeley, of course.
Yeah, of course. Small boats, mussel shells, delirious vessel in which the mad are piled up and cast on the river far from the city. Then, in my reading of Foucault's text, I quickly saw the vanishing point I wanted to reach. Ah oui, c'est ça. It's again Oscar Wilde, but there are men, il fait le cheval. The psychiatric space where the 19th century would have overturned this confinement of all deviants with the mad and make deviations into marks of madness. Homosexuality, the term was born in 1860 in Deutschland. The hysteric woman, the masturbating child who produces degeneration, the libertine and the pervert, manias, and so on. Between this vanishing point and the medieval space, there's a whole history. A line that I would follow thanks to the concept that marks Foucault's text throughout this history, the animal. It's direct boots en haut. In the Middle Ages, the furious beast in its demonic and disturbing rage rustles, rules, looks. It is the devil and the numerous version of sin that tempt, catch, drive people mad, and produce the most bestial sins: idleness, gluttony, drunkenness, envy, pride. Later in history, the animals in the 18th century become the opposite of the Middle Age. Foucault explained, bestiality doesn't reside in the animals. The animals is never mad. But in its domestication, madness is lost nature. On dit nature, right? The mad must reconnect with nature, which soothes them, and they must rediscover a natural milieu. We think about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He writes Les rêveries d'un promeneur solitaire. Comment on dit en anglais? Les rêveries. Yeah. Bon, c'est Rousseau. Implicit in this theme of the animal and nature, the concept of the against nature quickly and obviously emerges, which Foucault will analyze and which clearly has to do with the sexual problematics that run through his book. Against nature, loves for the same sex, for example, generated by monastic promiscuity, the repression of abnormal desire, non-reproductive sexuality that will be major object of surveillance and will shape the architecture that will refine this surveillance. Monastery, hospital, school, workshop, prison. Foucault will say, discipline is above all an analysis of space. It's what I tried to do in my work. After the animal, nature against nature, and the architecture of disciplinary space, I pursued another major theme of the book, which is the family. Non, c'est pas ça. Ouais. The family, la famille. Because it is within the nuclear family, that micro-society, that the risks of madness will be exacerbated and that sexual deviation will come to disturb its organization and risk its disorder. The man, le délinquant, It's a concept of Foucault, le délinquant. The man of unreason, the one who deviates from normalcy, is no longer just in the street monitored by the police, but in the family, sent by them to the asylum and interned at the slightest hint of dissipation, an unmanageable son, an alcoholic father, a loose daughter, an unwanted marriage. This is what interests Foucault when he worked on the lettres de cachet, but I must to say in French because it's the term, huh? C'est le terme, lettres de cachet. With the historian Arlette Farge, who makes my preface in my book. Arlette. The lettre de cachet was a petition from below, from families from neighbors, sent to the kings, and the minister to have an annoying individual locked up. These are themes that I identify and followed in the abundance of Foucault's text, and that allowed me to build a work of association between the idea and the image that comes to me from the text. Ah, voilà, c'est ça. The difficulty for me is always the battle that begins between a sentence and a drawing, and that the image must win over the power and beauty of the text. It's a meeting where the two spaces, images and sentences, intersect without ever hiding the other, but that function in their particularity side by side, like a pair of lovers, and which sometimes have a small disagreement. In this graphic work, I often have to assume the posture of an illuminator. En français, on dit un enlumineur. In illuminator, I direct, it's in the medieval art. I direct the lighting from the text to the image and from the image to the text. They each take turns playing the role of the margin. So margin, in the margin. In the margin, the little devils spin round about the sentence and end up disturbing it. So maybe I was able to help make the text a little crazy. Thank you. And this is an intervention about Jim Porter. It's a part of margin illuminated. On dit ça comme ça. And you see the every time in the margin you have the devil, and the devil it's all the time. You see, it's interesting in this draw because you have an eraserhead. You know, it's the beast. You have the beast here. You have the beast, les pattes. Which sort of beast, we don't know. And we have, in France, we say a cock. Cocorico! You know the cock? Because in the medieval art, we lot eraserhead, a lot of time we eraserhead. And in the monastère, les moines, comment on dit les moines? Monks. Makes a lot of draw with their devil everywhere, inside the line, inside the text. On the cathedral, everywhere is the time le temps du diable. Ok, voilà. Merci.
Very good.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, and I'm so happy to have met Patrick, and always grateful to Jim for your incredibly generous invitations. And I have so many friends here at Berkeley. It's always wonderful to come. So thank you for hosting me. I'm going to start with an epigraph. The relation of language to painting is an infinite relation. It is not that words are imperfect or that when confronted by the visible, they prove insuperably inadequate. Neither can be reduced to the other's terms. It is in vain that we say what we see. What we see never resides in what we say. And that's Michel Foucault from The Order of Things. Patrick Chambon opens his stunning graphic novel, Michel Foucault, Histoire de Folie, with an X in the form of a well-known passage from The Order of Things. It is in vain that we say what we see, and what we see never resides in what we say. The X, of course, is the chiastic relation between seeing and saying we find in Foucault, borrowed from Blanchot, elaborated by Deleuze. Parler, ce n'est pas voir. Voir, ce n'est pas parler. Like a Bosch painting or the gargoyles of Notre Dame, this book is a grotesque, a chimera, a monstrous hybrid. And I say this in the spirit of highest praise. In the few moments I have, I will explore the implications of this monstrosity, the half real, half imaginary, half word, half image, Foucauldian world Chambon constructs in this evocative sequence of charcoal, graphite, and ink drawings with captions. Let me first lay out two guiding principles or rules for reading images with text, the seeable with the sayable. One, reading text with images enacts relations of resonance, résonance. And two, this reading happens on a rifted ground. So, first rule for reading, relations of resonance. What this means, the captions don't go with the images. Rather, they resonate with one another, to use a term Chambon borrows from Deleuze. Let us read the word drawing panels created here through the lens of collage and its resonances as décollage, décalage, the opening of gaps, something we can perceive through a logic of discontinuity and juxtaposition in the reverberations of edges that allow the gaps to show. Those edges form frames, like tables, whose genealogical disordering instabilities generate the rift between seeing and saying. Voir, ce n'est pas parler. This brings me to my second rule for reading, which has to do with the book's ground, its substrate. What is the table or tableau that allows the graphic novel to speak? Foucault's original 1961 book, Folie et déraison, Histoire de la Folie, à l'âge classique, certainly. But it's also its material substrate. Charcoal, pierre noire, which is a dark graphite material, black ink, all of this on paper. Chambon's drawings are defiantly analog. There's not a hint of the digital here. These drawings cite the materiality of earth, paper from wood pulp, charcoal from twigs of willow or vine heated at a high temperature. So there's fire hidden in these drawings. And then there's graphite, elemental. Graphite is a crystalline form of carbon. It shines on paper like a rock in the sun. This analog knowledge is made for cutting. Carbon is extracted from the earth. So graphite mark on paper holds the memory of that planetary caesura, the cut of a mine into a planet. Together, these materials produce subtle interplays between light and shadow. Their textures allow for an expanded range of black to white gradations. Genealogy is gray. Another substrate, white gallery walls, and another from printing technologies, typeset pages to be assembled into a spine. All of this ground, this table, is actually a sedimentation of shifting tables, a concatenation of tableaux that overlap one another like tectonic plates, then crack apart like the famous dissection table with its umbrella and sewing machine that Foucault borrows from Lautréamont. in the preface to The Order of Things.
Ah, c'est beau.
Hein?
C'est beau.
Mais ça, c'est Salvador Dali.
Ah, incroyable, je connais pas.
Ouais.
Ouais.
What makes hybridity monstrous, Foucault reminds us, is not the oddity of unusual juxtapositions. What makes it monstrous is not the spark of the poetic, of things that don't go together, but more soberly, its genealogical strangeness. Genealogy is gray, meticulous, and patiently documentary. The fact that the common ground on which such meetings are possible has itself been destroyed. What might this mean with regard to Chambon's graphic novel? Let's start with the cover. Foucault as mollusk, as a singular fool in a ship of fools, as a subterranean eruption. Is this birth or death? Which way is he moving? Is he coming out or receding? A face emerging or disappearing at the edge of the sea? Juxtaposed with this image are some words. Michel Foucault, Histoire de Folie, not Histoire de la Folie. Something has shifted in the table that allows the definite article la to have been quietly removed. How are we to read this revocation of determination? Like the dark interiority of the mollusk, ship, cave, ruptured earth we see beneath the words, something strangely feminine offers itself here, but offers itself in its disappearance into the background. Like the déraison, the unreason, out of which Foucault's folie has been extracted. I want to compare this hybrid image, doubled by the cover image whose title doubles with a difference, Foucault's original, to the Bosch Grillos, G-R-Y-L-L-O-S, this may or may not be a familiar word, that Foucault invokes in the opening chapter of History of Madness, or The Ship of Fools. This is one of my collages. The Ship of Fools is one of my obsessions. Beautifully rendered in Chambon's book. And I'm just going to show you some of these images that are of the Ship of Fools. These are images that Foucault described in History of Madness as mi-réel, mi-imaginaire, half real, half imaginary. It's a term he uses over and over again. He used it again years later in his description of the panopticon in Discipline and Punish. So too, in the order of things, hybridity reigns, and nowhere more glaringly than in the figure of man, who becomes famously in the book's last line, a face dissolving into sand and sea. Man begins in the order of things as a kind of epistemic Grillo, half empirical, half philosophical, a recent invention, a fold in our knowledge, no more than a kind of rift in the order of things, out of which are extracted all the chimeras of the new humanisms. Let's go back to some of the early pages in Chambon's book. After opening the cover, which we might now imagine as cracking open a shell or lifting the veil, sails over a ship of fools, we enter into resonance, says Deleuze, invoking something like an echo from the Latin, resonare, to sound again. The shell-like book cover opens then into a mise en abîme, Foucault's favorite form. And indeed, if you Google mise en abîme, the first image that comes up is Velázquez, the Velázquez tableau that gives Chambon his epigraph about the gap between seeing and saying. We might say then that the cover, then the book's opening epigraph, then its opening pages, are repeated in this mise en abîme of discontinuities that resonate with one another. These résonances invite the reader, viewer of the graphic Foucault novel to plunge into a half-imaginary, half-real vortex that is also a mirror, an utterly real, utterly unreal heterotopia, side by side in juxtaposition with that rifted, folded monstrosity that is man. There at the threshold, a threshold that is book cover repeated as epigraph, then repeated again unspoken, in the return of a painting that is one of its many sources, and specifically as it appears in that rectangle of light that doubles the mirror, a doubling now mirrored in Chambon's book, in the rectangular shifting tableau of its own self-replicating thresholds, cover, epigraph, opening resonance, and so forth. As self-replicating mirrors, the nested rectangle tableaux repeat themselves, always, of course, with a difference. And again, a movement of abstraction confronts us here in the visual reverberations, as in André Gide's famous Shield from his 1893 notebook, where Gide writes, "In a work of art, I rather like to find transposed at the level of the characters the subject of the work itself." He compares this reflection of the work's subject at the level of the characters to the device from heraldry that involves putting a second representation of the original shield en abîme within it. And as Lucien d'Alembach explains in The Mirror in the Text, A's acceptance of the ability to be reproduced produces a lacuna within the identity of A, which is partially lost in the abyss through the shield that is added to it. So the addition of B to A, in fact, subtracts from it, makes a hole in it. That's mise en abîme, according to Gide. Atopia, aphasia. Madness returns to the very ground of Chambon's book. Here, in the Townsend Center, book pages turned sideways as the white walls of an exhibition. And we might recall here Saul Lewitt's incomplete open cubes filling a gallery, even as they mock the pristine neutrality of its white surface. This is from a 1999 show, actually right here in San Francisco at the MoMA. Or perhaps an earlier version of such ground in Goya's black paintings that lined the walls of his since destroyed black-walled house, La Quinta del Sordo, House of the Deaf Man, invoked by Foucault as Bosch's modern mirror at the end of History of Madness. He talks quite a bit about Goya at the end of History of Madness. And after Goya's death, the paintings were transferred from the deteriorating wallpaper to canvas, and they now hang in the Museo del Prado along with Las Meninas. So in these inversions and deconstructions of representations of ground, we experience the rupturing force of contingency in an erosive interplay of space and time, the ungrounding movement that is déraison, unreason, what Foucault calls the loss of what is common, the doing away with the site, the mute ground upon which it is possible for entities to be juxtaposed. What has been removed, Foucault writes in the preface to The Order of Things, is the famous operating table, the tableau, that allows us to think what we think. In Chambon and elsewhere, Michel Foucault does not offer us utopian consolations. What we find here, as elsewhere, is heterotopian disturbance. Later, in the Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault will apply the term archive to this mute ground of our thinking. Neither the place where documents are preserved, nor the documents themselves. Here, the archive is the law of what can be said at a particular moment, governed by what Foucault calls the historical a priori. This law of intelligibility renders our present strangely, even startlingly, unintelligible. This is the disturbance I want to name. Perhaps we can feel it when Foucault says, "It is not possible for us to describe our own archive, and yet its presence is unavoidable. It emerges in fragments, in the rarity of documents. The archive is the border of time that surrounds our presence, which overhangs it and which indicates it in its otherness. The archive," Foucault writes, "is a threshold of existence." How are we to live this threshold? Chambon offers us hybrid monsters that show us again disturbingly fragments of our own violent present. In History of Madness and later in Lives of Infamous Men, the archive of madness emerges as speech, as the sayable, in the traces of the infamous, les infâmes, an 18th century police term for homosexual. This is what comes out in the Lettres de Cachet. Side by side with the seeable, les bûchers de Sodome, the charred traces of sodomites burned at the stake. Between archival speech and the spectacle of the scaffold, a gap cracks open that fractures our perception into a different light, into the violence of illumination, into the destructions of a present that cannot be thought. Here are some resonances, these are just resonances, between the world Chambon renders, so La Salpêtrière, Pinel's asylum, prison, school, the vicious dogs and Inspector Mouche that plague Foucault, and a present we can only fail to describe. So here are some of the resonances. The ground that is our threshold of existence. On a vu ça hier.
Oui, c'est fou.
Oui.
Tu l'as amené d'hier. Ah, dis donc.
C'est l'inspecteur Mouche. The ground that is our threshold of existence, our archive of sedimented tables, has shifted again, is shifting as we speak. For example, the wandering existence of the Stuttifera Navis is not simply detained in a great confinement. The ship of fools becomes a drug gang's vessel, tracked and bombed by MQ Reaper drones, then sent back to us in all its horror as truth social posts ad infinitum. The great confinement of 1656 is repeated with a difference in the carceral archipelago Foucault describes in Discipline and Punish, with sites of intensification that witness a Boschian, Goya-esque world returning today as fragments of Gaza, detained in an open-air prison, but also now reduced to rubble, not simply bombed, but also bulldozed by caterpillar graders whose obliterating power does not stop at the violation of human finitude, the finitude of the living, but extends into the land that exceeds human finitude, the very ground that holds the bodies, the culture, the traditions of a people. So this is about the desecration of graves. Can we inhabit this threshold of existence as a question, living the question as Foucault tried to do, as a struggle without an answer, as what he called le renvoi ironique de la question? What is the question anyway? One answer might be experience, something Chambon insists on in his rendering of Foucault. Foucault once called History of Madness his experience book, Mon livre expérience, with the beautiful double meaning of the French expérience, where experience is also an experiment. The renvoi ironique de la question de l'expérience, the ironic return of the question of experience, is experimentation as questioning. How to face up to the man, Foucault's man, the one he sees disappearing at the edge of the sea. So let me end on a queer note. The book's cover image is mirrored at its end by another mise en abîme, Foucault, clad in leather, descending into a club, perhaps right down the road in San Francisco. A queer culture now gone, no doubt, reduced to another kind of rubble generated by the developers' bulldozers and cranes. Nevertheless, allez, on sort. We might read this now as a call to laughter or dance before the dance runs out. Come on, let's go out. But of course, this dance, this laughter, could be our last. The imperative, allez, is shrouded in the human finitude of the future anterior, of the will have been. The subject of knowledge, that, quote, enslaved sovereign, that transcendental empirical doublet of Western knowledge, first objectified as madman, says to himself, allez, on sort, becoming we know not what, an experience without a subject, a sequence of text and images from which all personalism will have been bled away. This is why I imagine Foucault as sapphic, in the mode we find in Anne Carson's If Not Winter, translations of Sappho, where the Foucauldian rift that is man is also a bracket, the mark of the la that is lost, when papyrus burns, crumbles, dissolves into water. Perhaps the cover's Grillo-like mollusk, shell, ship of fools, crust of the earth, is also a meaning whose insides were hollowed out long ago by the erosive contingencies of time. Today, as we view these stunning images of madness by Patrick Chambon, let us follow Foucault's directive to view the past not as signs we might read and decipher, giving them meanings in terms of the present, but rather more strangely as a history of the present. In this time of rubble and ice, in this time of what Arlette Farge calls in her preface to Chambon's book, fallen bodies, corps dits déchus. Perhaps, as Foucault puts it in the 1961 preface to Folie et Déraison, time itself is fallen, un temps déchu, giving way to we know not what. Thank you.
I have just a few very rash thoughts about the history of madness, which I'll try to share, except I've just disconnected the slideshow. How do I do this? I need, okay. The History of Madness is a massive book. A handful of Lynn's students this semester were balking at the book's dimensions. They told her that they found Foucault to be verbose and repetitious. Foucault would have bridled at the criticism of the Gen Zers. He was justly proud of his first major publication. It is part poetry, part history, and part plea for social justice. And he never ceased to refer to it down to the remainder of his all too brief but brilliant career. Born in 1926, he succumbed to AIDS in 1984, aged 56, a year after his last trip to Berkeley as a visiting professor here. How to tackle this monumental work? It heralded a new approach to institutional histories that Foucault himself went on to refine in his later scholarship, as he was creating entire fields of study that changed the way academia went about exploring the relationships between power, disciplinary structures, and modes of subjection and subjectivation in our modernity. One way to parse the overall architecture of the history of madness is to think of the study as having three interlocking parts. First, the ascendancy of the modern conception of madness during the classical age of France, mid to late end of the 18th century, on the heels of a number of medieval and Renaissance traditions and rituals in literature, theology, art history, or art, and in culture and society. Second, there was an institutional history of forms of governance that contributed to the definition of madness and that were in turn defined by it. And third, there are the underlying causes of which this entire history is but a symptom. Foucault's history covers each of these areas. But as is true of history writing in general, etiologies, explaining why things emerge when and as they do, are the most elusive aspects of any historical account. And Foucault's History of Madness is no exception. The work also contains some very interesting surprises that I will try to tease out quickly today. Let's begin with the title, History of Madness. Not the history of madness, but implicitly a history of madness. In the original 1961 edition, madness appears alongside unreason, déraison. In the later editions, unreason was dropped from the title Immediately, one wants to ask, what is the difference between these two words? Are they synonyms or somehow different? And even before asking that question, one would like to know, or one should like to know, what exactly is madness? How is it defined? And who has the right to define it? To put this in more direct form, who speaks the word madness, and on behalf of whom? To be sure, Foucault is not insensitive to the evolving and ever slippery meanings of madness in his study. He knows very well that madness is no one thing, that it has no one name, that its scope changes over time. Être insensé, I'll just read the English, being out of one's mind, alienation, madness, folie, delir, delirium, unreason, hysteria, paranoia, melancholy. The words, often closely synonymous, mount up to a stupefying degree. It is evident that the late 18th century French culture had learned to become verbose about its mechanisms of repression, producing entire lexicons in order to label what reason and rationality had to reject, confine, and treat therapeutically, or else remove from sight and condemn to silence. The history of madness has already outlined the sort of dynamic that would later famously mark Foucault's 1978 study, Volume 1 of the History of Sexuality, where he makes the astonishing but counterintuitive point that the culture of we other Victorians, the regime that we still inhabit today, was one that, he says, speaks verbosely of its own silence, that it was not repressed, but was caught up in the paradox of conjuring into being sexual repressions by the mere fact of uttering the word in a positive form. Negation is a form of positivity. The history of madness likewise tracks the positing of a negation, the production by reason of its nemesis, madness, and unreason. He speaks of this negativing process as a new positive phenomenon that accompanied the advent of positivism. But perhaps we are moving too precipitously here. What is this madness that is being posited? In French, fou and folie can mean either fool or and folly, respectively, or madman and madness, respectively. One of the major arcs in his history, in his study, is in fact the historical shift that occurs between the figure of the fool and the figure of the madman. Erasmus's book, written in 1509 in praise of folly, L'Éloge de la Folie in French, Laus Statutiae in Latin, which it was originally written in, is a satirical critique of the vanity and folly of humankind. It speaks of fools, not of the mad. The first chapter of Foucault's study takes its name, Stultifera Navis, from a medieval trope and practice that we've heard about from Patrick and also from Lynn, the casting away of unwanted elements of the social body on riverboats, the way lepers were formerly sequestered to the margins of cities. And as this is epitomized by Hieronymus Bosch's painting from around 1500, The Ship of Fools. But let's pause for a moment and dwell on this painting and ask, who is speaking here? On one level, the question is nonsensical. The painting is silent, and the voices of the chattering fools on board cannot be heard. The painting is caught in what Foucault calls le silence des images, the silence of images. Are the speakers mad or are they foolish? That is, madcaps. One problem is that we cannot ask them. But what would they even recognize the difference if we did? If they were truly mad, would they confess this to us? If they were truly foolish, might they not do the same, claiming, like the Cretan liar, to be mad while, perhaps, possibly, pulling our leg? Neither can we ask Bosch. His title is in its own way mute. or rather richly ambiguous, The Ship of Fools. He was satirizing a famous set of woodcuts accompanying verses by the Swiss theologian and satirical critic of the church, Sebastian Brandt, whom Foucault talks about. These were published in 1494 under the title of Das Narrenschiff, the Ship of Fools in German, a satire on fools or the insane. This is the quandary that launches Foucault's study, though he never puts it in this way. The burning question that we learned to ask from Foucault is qui parle, who is speaking? And it lingers throughout the 600 verbose pages of Foucault's Histoire de Folie. The genius of Patrick Chambon's artwork is that it heads straight into the problem that Foucault identified, the silence of images. When I first saw Patrick's extraordinary creations, I was already wondering about the problem of the ambiguity between fou and fou, a folie, and worrying that Foucault was speaking too much on behalf of the institutions that he was simultaneously critiquing. I wanted to hear what these so-called mad persons were saying. I thought at first that Patrick's work was giving voices to the insane, projecting, if not their voices, then their fantasies, a rich phantasmagoria of insanity looked at from the inside out. But as I reflected more deeply on the question, it struck me that in Foucault's book, we are never given access to the inner workings of the insane, the mad. As with the Bosch painting, or with another image, this time of the grill that we just heard about from Lynn, from another one of his works that's quoted by Patrick as well. To ask what the mad are thinking might well be to ask too much for too much. For starters, madness may have been a part of their vocabulary, but they were not its originators. The label was applied to them and for them, but not by them. How could it be otherwise? All that we can trace is the imagination of madness in the eyes of the sane, the early modern authors and painters and the later technocrats who will put this imagination, this imagining, into concrete practice. One of Foucault's major points is to offer a history of the invention of madness out of the traditions of the fool. And it is indeed tempting to read his study in a teleological fashion, as madness, born out of foolishness, becomes identified and institutionalized in the modern sense. It is medicalized, psychiatrized, if that's a word, moralized, interned for treatment, or just languishing in dark buildings, at first in hospitals, then in prisons and insane asylums. Foucault is a master of ventriloquy. He even manages to make architecture, the spaces of confinement, speak. Earlier, I suggested that the history of madness anticipates the program of the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, in its biopolitical dimensions. But Foucault is anticipating one more feature of his later writing. He has begun to learn to be verbose himself about the objects of his own study, not in the way that students in Lynn's class complained, but in a different way. One of the hallmarks of Foucault's method is his style. And it is a style that involves making disciplinary apparatuses speak, to utter out loud what they think, even against their own will. It is a form of ventriloquism, and it makes for an exciting, but also at times frustrating read. One never quite knows who is speaking, the subjects or objects of Foucault's studies, or Foucault himself. Thoughts shrouded in secrecy, erotic and transgressive desires, flirtations with the far side of every limit, are verbalized in titillating detail. They chase the demons into the light in order to remove them from sight. At this point, another question comes to mind. Whose demons are those poor fools? And it is here that another reading of History of Madness suggests itself. But it is a disturbing one, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move very quickly. Foucault's history is not a history of the objective phenomenon we know or suppose we know as madness. It is a history of what he calls the long imaginary kinship of associations and practices that can be traced throughout the whole of Western culture, but not simply traced because, as he adds, the assemblage of motifs has never ceased to haunt the imagination of the West. What Foucault is tracing is a terror, the great fear, which is the title of one of his chapters, that was racking the modern mind and that produced the phenomenon of madness. But why, he asks, did this sudden formulation of a theme in literature and iconography, and here I'm quoting or paraphrasing, erupt so brusquely around the 15th century? That's the etiology question. The fact is that Foucault has not gone far enough back in time. If the division of the world into stulti and sapientes goes back to the Stoics, the question of the difference between the fool and the mad is explicitly posed by Diogenes the Cynic in the time of Aristotle. Most people, he's recorded as saying, are so nearly mad that a finger makes all the difference. We don't have to speculate which finger he used to illustrate this aperçu, because, which he surely applied as much to himself as to others, because he tells us, another quote, if someone goes around with his middle finger extended, he will appear to be mad, but not if it is with his forefinger. Pierre Charon, quoted by Foucault, agreed. Wisdom and folly are surprisingly close. It's but a half a turn from the one to the other. The difference, Foucault adds, and I think this is both ventriloquy and speaking in his own voice, is imperceptible. Madness and folly have been two close neighbors for millennia, but the same is also true of madness and reason. Foucault's work traces not the birth of madness, but the rebirth of the frightening anxiety that reason is itself a form of madness. Foucault knows very well that madness is a phenomenon, as he says, in the realm of the fantastical, but not in the rigor of medical thought. A pure phantasm of the rational mind that seeks to assure itself of its own sanity. Madness is a projection of a fear, the fear that reason is not quite rational, onto an external scapegoat. Fear, but also fascination, for in its verbosity, the age of reason could not cease speaking about its own proximity to what drew it closer to its unwanted twin sibling. The animal in the human, the animality of the human. Shunned and excluded, madness was continually kept in close range and in constant view. Autopsy of reason, surveilling itself. But also something worse, for in the haunting words of Adorno, do I have it?
It was just there. It was just there, yeah.
Yes. Whoever imagines disasters desires them. We can make mental references to our own political chaos today. Here we come up against a truly disturbing problem. The idea of madness, as Foucault has constructed it, is something of a trap. It's literally unthinkable, and the word is never innocent. There's no question that his study is a deeply moving portrait of our excluded kindred spirits. You cannot read this work, I certainly cannot, without sympathizing with their plight. But let me ask you this, when our sympathies reach out to this population, are we identifying them as fools or as mad? As being somehow like us, but not quite like us? Can we ever think of madness without falling into this trap? Though he has sprung the trap by writing the secret history of reason's own madness, the brief and somewhat foreshortened history of a disavowed phantasm, that's what it is, Foucault falls into the trap himself. Instead of dwelling on the uncertain and hazardous border between madness beyond the limits of reason, which he claims to find incarnated in Nietzsche and Van Gogh and Artaud and others, not in their so-called sane periods, but in their final fits of madness, or as he writes, the last words of Nietzsche, the final words of Van Gogh. And perhaps, he adds, Artaud's cries of rage. More pressing than the question of whether Foucault has written a history of madness or a history of folly is the question of how we can navigate a problem that, as he shows, goes to the very heart of our being. Thank you. So we do have time. We're actually on time for questions, and I'd ask you to direct most of them to Patrick Chambon, if you can, and to Lynn, but not me.
Yes,
Oh, sorry.
yes.
Please.
Tu traduis, hein, Lynn.
Oui, d'accord. Tamaris.
Ah, ok. Ah, super.
Elle peut aller.
D'accord.
Oh, okay. Hello, there you
There we
go.
go.
I was like fascinated seeing every single one of them and the references to art history that you quote almost in every single frame of that you're making. But I was particularly interested in the David Wojnarowicz reference to the Silence Equal Dead poster, because it's one of the only ones created, that one of the only images referenced post the death of Foucault, and referencing also his death in terms of AIDS-related complications. So I'm wondering about that use of that image specifically, and if it's the latest one in terms of art history, finishing with such an iconic image of the AIDS crisis.
Alors, il parle du performeur Vorwitz, là, oui, et il dit que c'est la seule référence à l'histoire moderne, c'est ça, et quelle est sa question?
Why finishing with that, the image of Wojnarowicz in terms of like the iconic image from the...
Ça n'est pas... Tu traduiras peut-être, ou vous traduirez, parce que je vais lui répondre plus rapidement comme ça. Ça n'est pas la fin, ça, de l'histoire. Là, c'est un moment où, souvent, d'ailleurs, Lynn, elle a montré le visage enterré, c'est le même performeur. Voilà, parce que c'est un homme qui protestait dans les années 90, donc contre la politique new-yorkaise qui négligeait les malades du sida.
Against New York's politics that were neglecting those sick with AIDS.
Et donc, à un moment donné, en fait, je travaille comme ça, c'est-à-dire que je travaille presque comme en séance analytique, au sens psychanalytique du terme, c'est-à-dire que j'ai des associations d'images et d'idées en fonction du texte de Foucault. Ah, c'est un peu rapide.
No, ça va, ça va, ça va. I work very much as if I were in a psychoanalytic session in association with images by Foucault.
Et là, à ce moment-là, j'utilise la référence à ce performeur qui est effectivement mort du sida dans les années 1990.
So here I'm just using this performer who in fact did die of AIDS in the 80s, 90s.
Parce
80s.
que dans le texte, alors c'est pas la dernière image, the last image, it's Foucault with me in the back room at San Francisco in 17. So c'est une projection, hein, it's a projection. Mais là, c'est a moment where you speak about psychiatrique, la psychiatrie du 19e siècle, et la psychiatrie du 19e siècle beginning to
Psychiatry of the 19th century.
Homosexuality like a nosographie psychiatrique, and it's during aux États-Unis, c'est 1972, je crois, non?
In the
Là,
US
c'est
until
sorti de la
1972.
Et en France, c'est plus tard, Et donc là, pour moi, c'est une métaphore. C'est pour ça qu'au début, dans
For me, it's a metaphor. That's why in the beginning.
In the first image where you have je ne sais jamais dire son nom parce qu'il est polonais, alors c'est Wojnarowicz, non, je ne sais plus. You know this name?
David Wojnarowicz is the artist.
Wojnarowicz. Okay, bon. il a cousu sa bouche
He sewed his lips shut
pour signaler justement le silence politique à ce moment-là, parce que c'était un leader d'Act Up et Act Up faisait des performances très violentes. Et donc il a cousu vraiment sa bouche et ça m'intéressait de le faire venir dans l'image.
So he sewed his lips together in order to protest the silence over AIDS. He was a member of ACT UP, and so I was interested in resurrecting his image. Oui.
Oui, parce que c'est pour rappeler que malgré le temps, malgré l'histoire, les choses résistent longtemps dans les concepts psychiatriques, ça va résister longtemps, a long time, you know. It's a book of Foucault. Foucault make a story. He begin at the 15e siècle,
15th century.
15th century, and the end it's at the end of 19th century. And in this story, you have a line, but the line is why the deviants are together with the madman and the deviant with les guillemets, and the deviant with the madman vont devenir une seule chose, one thing, and some of the homosexuality, for example, va devenir une folie. Ça va être une folie psychiatriquement.
So the deviant and the madman fuse into one entity, and the homosexual becomes a madness, psychiatrically speaking.
Mais souvent, excuse-moi, la réponse était un peu longue, merci de m'aider. So usually, when I draw with a text, I love to be very anachronic. I love anachronism. For Foucault, it's a little bit different because you have a story with the medieval art, and I love medieval art. So, but generally, I love anachronism. Donc, ça peut être moderne with Foucault speak about la léproserie, les lépreux, et lepers.
I didn't mean that it was the last image of the book, but the most contemporary in terms of art
oui,
history.
d'accord, oui. Bon. Oui, c'est vrai.
Post the death of Foucault, because it dies in 84. This is from 89.
But in my book, it's very cryptic. On peut dire ça en anglais? Cryptic. It's very cryptic. It's a lot of things sont hiding, cachés. A lot of things are hiding. But it's not it's not the only reference of the contemporary because you have sometimes, I make sometimes with a film. I don't know if you have seen the film Tom of Finland. Bon, j'ai utilisé ça aussi. I use that in my book, but usually I like to recadrer.
I like to reframe.
Cut and collage, cut and resserrer and resserrer. So you don't know where I take my image, you know. Bon. Another question? Ladies first. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much for this. I'm wondering about the positioning of Foucault in these drawings, because honestly, I did not expect to see Foucault himself in these drawings, and I'm particularly struck by the panopticon drawing, the 4 drawings that make the panopticon.
Yeah.
And Foucault,
ici.
that one. And Foucault's head on top of the tower, and he's the one surveilling. And in opposition to that, for example, that other drawing that is on the cover of your book, where Foucault himself is constrained. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the positioning of Foucault himself across these drawings.
Ah, mal traducteur, alors.
Alors, elle s'intéresse au positionnement de Foucault dans
Comme
vos
je le
dessins,
représente, c'est ça?
comme vous le représentez, par exemple ici, avec Le panopticon,
Oui.
il est au-dessus, c'est celui qui surveille,
Oui.
et alors que sur la couverture, c'est lui
Et en
qui est
face,
traqué,
oui.
incarcéré. Donc,
Oui.
y aurait-il des choses à dire sur la représentation de Foucault?
Why?
dans-
Your question is why sometimes in face and sometimes it's de côté, or it's not your question?
C'est qu'il surveille.
Ah,
dans cette
ça.
image,
Qui surveille et c'est lui qui est emprisonné.
lui, il est opprimé.
And just curious about how you thought about the positioning of Foucault.
Alors, there are two problems for drawing. Et c'est des problèmes de dessin. In this draw, you have a clin d'œil. Comment on dit un clin
A
d'œil?
wink.
Wink.
You have a clin d'œil of the panoptique, because the panoptique is in 1975 in Surveiller et Punir. But
Discipline and punish.
in this book, History of Madness, it's very fascinating because Foucault beginnings to have his future concept with sexuality, with surveillance, and with panoptic. It's not he don't speak exclusively on panoptic, but I make this draw because I would like to have in a panoptic, you know, it's you have in a center you have a tour, and in a tour, and in a circle you have some cellules de prison. You have where you have prisoner.
Prison cells with
And
prisoners.
in a tour, le fascinant, c'est que in a tour, you don't see if there are somebody in a tour. So you don't see if somebody see you when you are a prisoner. And in this page, every time I draw one page and opposite another page every time, because like Lynn say that, if I understand, it's like a tableau. So one page, we are in back of Foucault, and Foucault, we are là, ici, là. Hein.
Je pense que la question, c'est pourquoi est-ce qu'il est en position de surveillance? Pourquoi est-ce que c'est lui qui surveille?
Parce que c'est l'auteur.
Ah, d'accord.
C'est celui qui parle. It's somebody, he talk, il parle. C'est celui qui a le pouvoir de la parole et qui fabrique un livre. He makes a book. He makes History of Madness. So he is, and Foucault, in the Foucault is very interesting by the painting and visuality, and in a beautiful course of Deleuze at the end of at the death of Foucault in 1986. Deleuze make a book, Foucault, and he speaks a lot about two big concepts for Foucault: visuality and énonciation. And comment on dit en énonciation? Speech. Et Foucault, il est très intéressé par le visuel. We speak yesterday with Lynn with the light, but the concept of the light for Foucault is very, very stratifié, very complex. Foucault like to speak about how you see, who you see, what is the condition of when you see, quand on te regarde. You know, it's the position central of Foucault. It's because I show Foucault here, and this is oh, it's me, huh? I make the crazy man, okay, bon. But this is les parlementaires of Daumier, because c'est la loi, the law. Daumier makes a lot of, it is a caricaturist of 19th century, but c'est la loi. Et là, at left, you have a Degas, et it's Degas, c'est, you have a Degas, Edgar Degas. This is a woman, normally she's at opera. She's at opera. And Foucault speak sometimes panoptic. It's like an opera. It's like a theater, you know. Sometimes he speak about that. It's like a theater. You have a scene. on te voit depuis des points dans l'espace. Okay. For the cover, you have the question for the cover. I think, you know, I'm a son of Warhol. Warhol say, why you go to the cinema? You go to cinema for see the faces of the star, of the superstar. You go to the cinema for see the faces of Nico in Chelsea Girl. You know, you have three écrans, comment on dit les écrans? Screens, and you have Nico, and she cut her hair and, for 1 hour. Et c'est fascinant parce que on the cover you must to have the face, because the face is a dialogue. C'est du Lévinas, mais the face c'est you and me. You look at me. Comment il dit De Niro? Why you look at me? In a film. But the face it's very different. It's je t'attrape when I look at you, eyes on eyes. You know, it's different. It's two problems of draw.
One question.
I'm curious about your creative process. I mean, you read this 600-page book. I think you said you read it several times. That, and I'm just
3 years.
wow. And so, okay, you have this book. First, do you do it 50 pages by 50 pages? Is it?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's a question about how can I the fabrication inside me, the fabrication with a text, I say, dazzling, j'ai dit éblouissant.
Dazzling.
It's a huge text. So I read this text because I have something to do with the life. It's because I say biography of Foucault. I have something to do with the life of Foucault. So one time I read this text and je n'arrivais pas. Another time I read the text and I beginning to have an image. When I say I saw the text, it's really like that. I saw, because in the language of Foucault, it's very Baroque. You know, you have a lot of image, and the image monte, I begin to cut the text. I make a line, you know, because I want to make the line the deviant with mad, beginning, deviation, a form of madness. I have this line. So I pursued the line, but before I have the text, I write with my hand and a stilo. I hate that. I have the text, I write the text, and it's necessary for me because when you write the text, you are slow and it's a special time, and the image monte and a text. I cut the text, and I take the paper. And when I have my text, it's a big work. But before it's the text. When I have my text, I have my paper, une esquisse, a paper like that. I cut in 4 parts, and I cut my text, and I wait the image after, and the image come. Sometimes I make 2 days without image. Je sais pas, un texte. Sometimes it's very difficult. I say, what does it mean? Qu'est-ce que c'est ça? Mais souvent, j'ai l'image.
Often I grasp the image.
I have one question. Could you heard something?
Oh, that was
Could you please have a look at the pictures, the graphics, speak to Patrick about his work, and there's wine and cheese, and I believe in the other room. Please, thank you all for.
Thank you. Thank you.